Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second part of our series of talks on the Second Vatican Council, the documents of the Second Vatican Council. This morning we're going to be talking about Dignitatis Humanae, which is the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom. The English title is often rendered on the right of the person and communities to social and civil freedom in matters religious. And now that we've talked in the previous series, the previous iteration of the series about the Second Vatican Council and the document Lumen Gentium, I don't need to go over the history of those things so much, and we're going to dive right into this text. So this text concerns clearly the question of whether or not a person has a right to follow whichever religion he judges to be true. And much of this presentation will concern what is meant by this term, right. And understanding this term itself depends on understanding the anthropological and psychological underpinnings of this document. And when I was rehearsing this document last night, I realized that it's quite a doozy. There's a lot going on here, and I'm going to do my best to try and touch on all of the important points in a timely fashion. So anyway, what do all these terms mean? Right in anthropology and psychology. Psychology, etymologically, and in the field of theology, refers quite literally to the study of the soul, and that's what we mean to do today. And anthropology means the study of man in the general sense, the generic sense, man. And so I'm not talking about Freudian psychoanalysis or the study of primitive cultures, but rather trying to understand human nature, and in particular how that relates to our spiritual faculties of intellect and will, how we come to know and how we come to believe. And here, also, these spiritual faculties of intellect and will are where we find the source of human dignity. And this is referenced in the title of the document, Dignitatis Humanae, of human dignity. The dignity in the Catholic understanding refers to the worth of the human being, from Latin dignus, meaning worth. And this worth is based on the kind of creature that a human being is, based on the fact that a human being is endowed with intellect and will. That person has a particular dignity, a kind of dignity, and once we know that, that informs the way in which we're supposed to behave toward that person. And then finally, so we have to understand that, and then we have to understand how that pertains to matters religious. So on to the psychology and anthropology. First off, man is a rational animal. And what this means, in a nutshell, is that we are sensate beings who are also capable of attaining true knowledge and of acting in accord with that knowledge. And by true knowledge, what I mean is knowledge of general things that are true in all times and places. Mathematical truths are a simple example. If you think of geometry, everyone here knows what a circle is, and yet you've never seen one. A circle is a shape wherein every point on a line is equidistant from the center point, but no physically existing circle actually perfectly conforms to this definition. What this simple demonstration shows is that your knowledge of general things is more than a mere collection of sense data. No number of circles in the world, upon visible inspection of them, would reveal this definition. You have to have something more. You have to have intellectual apprehension. You know things that transcend the physical world. You know things that are true in all times and places, and this is unlike the knowledge of an animal, which only knows particular things, and animals only react to those things on the basis of instinct and memory, not on the basis of true knowledge. And so much for our knowledge. We know something about the intellect. That's what the intellect enables us to do. And what about the will? The will is also commonly called the rational appetite, since it is the appetite that corresponds to this rational or intellectual power of attaining true knowledge. What this means for our purposes is that just that we can know things that are good and true and general, true in all times and places, so we can also desire such things. A dog does not desire peace or justice or virtue or even to be a good dog. What a dog desires is something particular and sensate, perhaps something to be praised for being a good dog, but not goodness. Now, one important thing to know about the intellect and the will is that the intellect precedes the will in matters of action. What this means is that I must know something before I can desire it. I can't desire anything unless I first have some knowledge about what it is. Now, the intellect and the will each do a particular kind of thing. They each have, correspondingly, natures or inclinations. The intellect is inclined towards the true. That's what explains what it does. All of man's intellectual activity is inclined toward learning more about the truth, and the will's inclination is toward the good. What this means is that everything we choose, everything, even if it's a sin, we choose because we perceive it as good in some way. If I skip Mass, for example, because I want to watch a hockey game, what I'm choosing in that instance is a true good, the good of leisurely entertainment, but I'm choosing that good over the good of following the divine law. And since I would in that case break the divine law, what I'm doing is a sin, but I'm nevertheless still trying to pursue some good, albeit in a misguided way. So one final anthropological point before getting into the document itself. That we are inclined toward the true and the good by our intellects and wills is not a fun little fact about our natures. It means something much more important. It means that we are in fact fulfilled by these things. We find our happiness by seeking that which is true and that which is truly good. We ought, therefore, to seek these things. This is the origin of our obligations. We fulfill these things, we seek these things because they fulfill us. We should seek the true and the good. Now, this little foray into psychology, though tedious and boring though it was, helps make a lot of sense of a number of the major claims that we find in Dignitatis Humanae. Section 1 says, for example, that we are bound to seek the truth. It is a responsibility, in fact, that we have. This follows readily from what I've already said. The truth fulfills us, and so we have a duty to seek it and, quote, to hold fast to it, as Dignitatis Humanae says, once we find it. Section 1 of this document also says that we Christians have a duty to spread the good news. And this also makes sense in light of the anthropological and psychological discussion that we just had. We believe in Christ as Christians and his church. We believe that the news that we have to share is good, and so naturally, we want to share the good things that we have with other people. But the document also says, toward the end of section 1, that we, and civil society in general, should not coerce anyone to become Christian. And the reason for this is also clear from the preceding discussion. It's also related to something that the document says later on, that truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth. And how is this the case? As I said before, the intellect is naturally inclined towards the true. What this means is that, in matters that are evidently true, the intellect necessarily assents to them. Once, for example, you understand the concepts of to and for and addition, then you also naturally understand, you readily see that 2 plus 2 make 4. In fact, you cannot not see that, and you cannot make someone else see it. All you can do is present such a truth to a person and wait for them to perceive their truth, its truth, on their own. Consequently, as St. Augustine said, you don't have to defend the truth itself. It will defend itself. In such matters, those matters that are evidently true to our intellects, you should not try to coerce anyone into assenting to them, because you can't. If they don't see that something is obviously true, or that something that is obviously true is true, then no amount of begging or pleading or prodding will make them see it. They have to see it themselves. But not all things are like this. Not all things are self-evidently true, such as basic mathematics. In other matters, we only have partial evidence that something is true, and perhaps we even have contradictory evidence which suggests that same thing is false. What do we do in such cases? In such a case, we do not, or should not, simply assent to the truth of something. Instead, we can choose to assent. This is what Aquinas would call belief, choosing to assent to something for which we have partial evidence, though not conclusive evidence. If, for example, somebody accused my friend of stealing something from me, and my friend claimed to be innocent of this crime, I could choose to believe my friend. I do not do this because I have evidence regarding the circumstances of the alleged crime, but rather because I know that my friend is a good man, and so on that basis I trust him. Belief, then, for Aquinas is a situation where you have some evidence that something is true, so belief is reasonable. It's reasonable to assent to something, but the evidence itself isn't conclusive. If it were, you'd have knowledge. So, since you don't have knowledge, but you do perceive that it is good to assent to the true thing, you choose to assent to it, and that's how you have belief in something. This element of choice in choosing to believe something involves the will, and this is why belief, unlike knowledge, is a moral matter. We do not think someone a good person because she knows a lot about geometry, but we might think well of her because of her devotion to her husband and her belief in his dedication to her. Abraham believed in God, and this was credited to him as righteousness. It was not Abraham's knowledge that made him righteous, but rather his belief. And yet, in these matters of belief, we should still not coerce anyone. The will, remember, is inclined toward the good. So we don't believe something unless we think it is good to believe it. And coercion does not make us think that things are good. So, just as we should not coerce others in matters of knowledge, so we should not try to coerce people into believing the truths of the Christian faith, in part because we can't. In order to believe something, you have to view it as good. Coercion does not do this, but what does? Love, providing examples, respect, in short, treating someone with dignity. This is effectively what it means when Dignitatis Humanae says that people have a right to religious liberty. They have an obligation to seek the truth and to adhere to it once they find it. And we Christians have an obligation to share the truths of Christianity with them, but also to leave them free to make their own decisions in religious matters. There simply is no other way. But why would this be controversial? I think everything that I'm saying so far seems relatively straightforward. What is it about what I've said that would imply a break with church teaching prior to the Second Vatican Council? Even St. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, in Christendom of all places, holds that you should not coerce unbelievers into converting to Catholicism, since he says belief is a matter of the will. And his explanation is quite similar to the one that I've just given. The main problem is this: the right to religious liberty has been forcefully condemned by a number of popes prior to the Second Vatican Council. I myself first encountered such a condemnation in the encyclical Quod Aliquantum, which was promulgated by Pope Pius VI in response to the French Revolution. Pope Pius VI condemned the right of man to religious liberty as monstrous, in no uncertain terms. Furthermore, another Pius, this time Pius IX, condemned the following proposition in his famous Syllabus of Errors: every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. Remember, for him, that means that proposition is false, Again, a very clear condemnation of religious liberty. How can this discrepancy be reconciled? We can reconcile this by examining the meaning of the word right. What does it mean when I say that I have a right to something? What we mean today, as contemporary Americans, by saying this, that we have rights, is quite different from what authors of old, and particularly Catholic authors, would have meant when they said such things. I'll give you an example from ancient Rome, a pretty clear one, I think, in order to explain what I mean. The Roman jurist Gaius wrote of a jus altius tolendi, a right of building higher. To an American ear, this sounds like it is describing a person's ability to build something higher. In this case, Gaius is referring to a person's house. So it sounds like he's saying you have a right to build your house higher if you want to. But Gaius also speaks in the same breath of a jus altius non tolendi, which sounds like he's saying a right not to build higher. But that sounds absurd. Why would you need to explain to somebody that they have the right not to add an extra floor to their house? The reason for this apparent absurdity is because Gaius means something quite different by jus, the word we translate as right, and which is used in Latin as right in this document. I can keep my house as high as I want it, but this is not what Gaius means. What he means is that it is sometimes right not to build your house higher. As, for example, when a taller house might cast a shadow on your neighbor's vineyard. Jus in Latin, as the ancients used it, and as Aquinas uses it, refers not to what I can do, or not to what I am allowed to do, but rather what is right for me to do, according to justice. An American, under hearing this word, would probably think of it in the former sense, what we would call a subjective sense. If you have a right to freedom of speech, to religious liberty, and so on, it means that you can say what you want to say, you can follow the religion that you want to follow, and so on. But what I've described in Gaius is what we'd refer to as an objective right, rather than a subjective right. The objective right refers to what you should do in a given situation. In other words, the objective right is grounded in justice. The subjective right is not. Which right did Dignitatis Humanae uphold when it declared that people have a right to religious liberty? And which right did previous popes condemn? A close look at the text of Dignitatis Humanae reveals something interesting. In section 3, the text says, "Every man has the duty and therefore the right to seek truth in matters of religion." The right is understood in reference to a duty. It's a correlative. If you have a duty, then you have a right. It follows if you have a right, then you must have had a duty. So Dignitatis Humanae understands the right to religious liberty as a matter of justice. Therefore, it is an objective right, right in the sense in which Gaius meant. What the revolutionaries of 18th century France or in the US had claimed is that man can choose to follow whatever religion he pleases without regard for the objective truth of the matter. This is a subjective right to religious liberty, and this is what the popes of old had condemned. Now, my interpretation on this is not esoteric. It's not something unique. In fact, it's backed up by two recent magisterial documents. The first is Caritas in Veritate, promulgated by Pope Benedict XVI in 2009, and it says in paragraph 55 the following: "Religious freedom does not mean religious indifferentism, nor does it imply that all religions are equal. And more to the point, the International Theological Commission released a document very recently in 2019 called Religious Freedom for the Good of All, and it expresses this apparent discrepancy between Dignitatis Humanae and previous magisterial statements by saying that in the past, a certain ideological configuration of the state, referring to the revolutions in France and the United States in particular, a certain ideological configuration of the state which interpreted the modernity of the public square as an emancipation from the religious sphere, provoked the magisterium to condemn freedom of conscience, understood as legitimate indifference and subjective arbitrariness with respect to ethical and religious truth. So in other words, what this document is saying is that the previous condemnations referred to this kind of indifferentism, not religious liberty as Dignitatis Humanae understands it, but religious liberty as it was understood by American and French revolutionaries, as indifferentism, as subjective arbitrariness. You can follow whichever religion you want just because you feel like it. That's what's condemned. According to the Catholic Church, through the words of Dignitatis Humanae, there is one true religion, and people should seek it. And adherents of this religion, our religion, should promote it. But we, should also respect others in their search for the truth, since there can be no coercion in religious matters. The Church rejects the idea that there is no religious truth, and has rightly condemned the idea that, therefore, people have a right simply to follow whichever religion strikes their fancy. In sum, one might say that you do have a right to religious freedom insofar as you should follow the Catholic faith, and respecting your freedom to discern this yourself is an essential element of your path to conversion. So consequently, everyone has a duty to seek the truth, therefore they have a right to religious liberty, and we have to respect them in their search for the truth, and consequently, this is what it means to treat them with dignity in their search for religious truth. That's all. We have some time, so if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. But I think after this, they're going to start rehearsing a bit with the music. So if anyone have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Go ahead, Caleb. Yes, that's what I was referring to when I referenced the International Theological Commission's document. That's called Religious Freedom for the Good of All. It was promulgated in 2019, but it actually wasn't translated into English until quite recently. But it does, in section 15, address this particular problem, yes, with reference to Dignitatis Humanae and previous statements. Yeah. I'm not making this up. Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah, the most recent document that, to my knowledge, that deals with this is actually Pope Francis's recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti. He talks a lot about social media, and when I read the document myself, I was quite impressed with it. In those terms, I thought he was very perceptive, and I figured he must have had, maybe he's extremely online, I don't know, but maybe he has very good advisors on these matters. But in any event, his description of what actually happens on those platforms that you mentioned, Facebook and Twitter and so on, is extremely accurate. He talks about the sort of echo chamber that develops on those platforms, and he also talks about how a small number of people grow to dominate the conversation on those platforms. And so, if, as you point out, the platforms are supposed to be truly free, in the sense that they are supposed to respect people's ability to express themselves, then I think Pope Francis, what follows from what he says is that some policing is necessary on those platforms to ensure that a small number of very powerful people don't dominate the conversation. Now, how to pull that off, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know any coding or anything like that, but that doesn't mean that social media platforms can be left to self-regulate, so to speak, because then you'll get a very small number of people promoting their own ideas on it. Go ahead, Caleb. This document does come up, but I think more frequently the documents that come up are Nostra Aetate and Unitatis Redintegratio, which are both also documents in the Second Vatican Council. And the general approach of those documents is to approach evangelization by finding common ground on those people who belong to other religious communities, be they Christian or non-Christian. And so I think that approach in general is what in part has led to organizations like this, like the Ordinariate, where, as I said last time, the Catholic Church through the Ordinariate has identified certain means of expression as true and good and, in a sense, Catholic, and we've incorporated them into our own liturgy and practice, and this has been the benefit of all, and it has allowed some people the opportunity to convert to Catholicism while keeping the practices that they had previously. So I think that in general, in a very small nutshell, is the approach. All right, I think I'll stop now in order to try and save enough time to prepare for the next Mass. So thank you, everyone.